The ranger stopped mid-sentence, staring through binoculars at the sand below, because the signal wasn't a signal at all. It was a correction. Footprints led straight into the river, vanished completely, then reappeared higher up the beach, dry and deliberate. Rewritten, as if someone had made the wrong decision and barely survived it. The pilot lowered his voice and said, "That means he learned something down there." And no one asked what. Because people only change plans like that when the first one almost kills them. Ethan Cole entered the Grand Canyon alone in November 1991. Late season, fewer boats, colder nights. The kind of quiet that makes the river seem manageable. He trusted preparation, trusted routine, trusted the idea that experience stacked up into protection. He told the ranger he'd be out in under 2 weeks, weather willing, nothing dramatic expected. The launch was clean, the current steady, canyon walls sliding past like they always did, and for hours everything followed the version of the trip he had already accepted as reality. The shift came without warning, not violent, not loud, just decisive. The raft slipped into faster water. The bow dipped once, water crept over the edge, cold slammed his chest and stole his breath. And in the same motion the raft rolled, calmly, efficiently, as if correcting him. When he surfaced, coughing, the first thing he saw was his gear drifting away in pieces, cooler spinning, dry bag bouncing, oars knocking once before separating, everything essential choosing the river over him with quiet certainty. He grabbed the safety line, felt it snap tight against his shoulder, kicked until his boots scraped sand, and dragged himself onto a narrow beach that looked temporary, borrowed. When he stood, the canyon walls were already stealing the sun, shadows climbing fast, temperature dropping with them. He checked himself carefully, fingers numb, breath shallow. Nothing broken, nothing useful left intact either. The raft damaged but reachable, the radio gone, the silence thick and organized. He tried for height, for perspective, scrambling up slick rock until a handhold shifted just enough to stop him cold. His body flattened against stone without thought. Heart pounding, he backed down inch by inch, understanding clearly that falling here wouldn't injure him. It would end him. Back on the sand, he hauled the raft higher, flipped it, found a slow leak he couldn't properly fix. The cold began working into his legs, shaking followed, steady and exhausting. Night arrived quickly, heavier than expected, the canyon holding cold like a debt. He rationed movement, wedged himself where the wind bent away, listened to the river continue its work as if nothing had changed. Some time later, he heard an engine, distant and thin, real enough to hurt, gone before he could act on it, leaving him unsure whether it had happened at all. When morning light finally reached the sand, he understood that chasing the river blindly would cost more than it offered. Survival here wasn't about speed. It was about being seen. He began arranging debris deliberately, straight lines, shapes that resisted randomness, and while working he noticed something half buried near the waterline, a jagged piece of plastic, sun-bleached, not his, carried from somewhere else, proof that the canyon remembered people long after it finished with them. He held it briefly, looked up at the narrow strip of sky, then placed it carefully with the rest, committing to stillness, to visibility, to waiting in a place that rarely rewarded patience. By the second day, the canyon began testing him in smaller, meaner ways, the kind that don't announce themselves. The cold lingered longer in the shade. His hands stayed stiff even after the sun touched the sand, and hunger arrived early, sharper than expected, demanding attention he didn't want to give. He checked the raft again, hoping the leak had worsened enough to explain staying put, but it hadn't. It held air just well enough to tempt him, just poorly enough to punish him later. Late morning brought movement upstream, not voices, not engines, but sound carried oddly here. A low thud, then another, something striking rock, rhythm without pattern. He climbed a short rise to look and froze, halfway up, because on the far side of the bend he saw debris shift, not drift, but slide sideways against the current, as if guided. For a long moment he watched, heart climbing into his throat, until the truth settled in. It was his cooler, snagged briefly, released, continuing its quiet escape, hope flaring and dying in the same breath. He forced himself to eat sparingly, small bites, slow chewing, the kind of discipline that feels pointless until it isn't. When the sun reached its highest point, he added to the signal on the sand, widening it, making it uglier, less artistic, more desperate by design. That was when he noticed the second thing. Not plastic this time, but stone. A line of rocks arranged too evenly to be accidental, half-buried, old, worn. Someone else's attempt at order in a place that erased it quickly. The discovery unsettled him more than the cold, because it meant two things were true at once. Others had been here, and others had failed to be seen. He dismantled the stones, used them, expanded his own signal, refusing to inherit someone else's silence. By afternoon, the wind picked up, light at first, then steady, dragging sand across his ankles, softening edges, undoing work. He kept rebuilding, hands raw, jaw tight, telling himself the repetition mattered. Near dusk, the sound returned. Closer this time, unmistakable rotors. He ran to the waterline, waved both arms, jumped, shouted until his throat burned. The noise grew, then shifted, sliding away behind the canyon wall like it had chosen a different problem. He stood there long after it faded, shaking, unsure if the effort had cost more than it gave. That night the temperature dropped harder than before, the kind of cold that makes thinking expensive. He huddled tighter, rationed breath, woke repeatedly to check he could still feel his feet. Sometime before dawn he heard footsteps, close, soft, unmistakable. He sat up fast, heart hammering, then realized the sound matched the rhythm of his own movement, echoed and distorted, the canyon borrowing his fear and handing it back louder. Morning light found him exhausted but precise. He made a decision he'd been postponing. He would move, not far, not recklessly, just enough to reposition, to change angles, to be seen from somewhere else. He loaded what little he could onto the damaged raft, pushed into the water carefully, keeping close to shore, every scrape against rock sounding final. Around the bend, just beyond where the shadows broke differently, he saw it, fresh tracks in wet sand, not his, not old, leading away from the river. He stood there, water numbing his calves, understanding that staying visible now meant following them, and that following them meant stepping into a choice he could not undo. The tracks pulled him away from the water almost immediately, angled up the sand toward a break in the rock where the canyon folded inward. They weren't panicked, not staggered, spaced evenly like someone conserving energy. Ethan followed slowly, matching the stride, forcing himself not to hurry. The raft left tethered below, a calculated risk that made his chest tighten with every step upward. The climb was shallow but unforgiving, loose gravel sliding underfoot, hands searching for holds that felt solid only after they proved themselves. The tracks ended at a shallow alcove no deeper than a parked car, empty at first glance, then revealing details once he stopped rushing his eyes. A flattened patch of sand, scuffed stone, a darkened streak where water had been spilled deliberately, not dropped. Whoever had been here had rested, reorganized, made decisions. Ethan crouched, feeling a strange relief mixed with dread. Relief that the tracks hadn't simply vanished. Dread because the person who made them had moved on, and moved on for a reason. Inside the alcove he found the remains of a fire lay. Not ash, just heat-scored rock, blackened enough to prove intent, not enough to mean warmth. Nearby a scrap of foil pressed flat, folded and unfolded too many times, old but not ancient. The canyon suddenly felt smaller, crowded by the idea of proximity, by the realization that survival here was not unique. It was a repeating problem with a high failure rate. The wind shifted without warning, funneling through the stone, carrying the smell of water and something else, stale, human. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the ledges above, half expecting movement, A wave, a voice, anything. Nothing answered. He checked his watch, recalculated daylight, and accepted another hard truth. If he went back down now, he'd lose time. If he stayed, he risked cold and exposure again. Neither option felt clean. He decided to mark the alcove, not for rescuers, but for himself, a mental anchor in case he needed to retreat fast. On the way back down, he noticed a second set of marks, lighter, newer, barely visible where sand met stone, heading parallel to the first trail but lower, closer to the river. Someone had doubled back, or someone else had followed. At the waterline, he found the raft untouched, relief sharp enough to hurt. He loaded it quickly, pushed off with care, hugging the inside curve of the canyon, eyes scanning every beach, every break in the rock. The river carried him less than a quarter mile before forcing a choice. Shallow rapids ahead, manageable on a good day, risky with damaged gear and a tired body. He grounded the raft again, climbed out, and that's when he saw it. A scrap of bright fabric snagged high in a bush, fluttering weakly, unmistakably intentional. He stood there for a long moment, weighing distance against daylight, signal against shelter, finally reaching up and tearing the fabric free. A bandana, faded red, knotted at one corner. He tied it higher, added his own knot, doubling the message, then sat back on his heels, breathing hard, understanding that whatever game the canyon was playing now, he was no longer alone in it. As the light began to thin, he heard it again. Not rotors this time, but a shout. Distant, fractured by stone, real enough to change everything, close enough to be dangerous if he guessed wrong. The shout came again, clearer this time, stretched thin by distance but unmistakably human. Ethan froze where he stood, afraid that moving would erase it. He waited, counting breaths, the canyon returning only the river's steady noise. He answered anyway, shouting back once, then again, using the walls to carry it, choosing volume over words. Silence followed, long enough to make doubt creep in. Then a reply, closer now, urgent, wrong in its timing, as if the speaker hadn't expected an answer. Ethan moved upriver on foot, faster than he wanted to, slower than fear demanded. The raft left secured again, every step a negotiation with loose sand and tired legs. The voice came from above, not far. From a ledge he hadn't noticed before, he craned his neck and saw a figure crouched in shadow, waving once, then sitting back heavily. Relief and exhaustion crossing the distance together. The man was older, late 40s maybe, clothes sun-faded and stiff with salt, his face drawn tight around the eyes. He introduced himself as Mark Jensen, said his solo trip had gone wrong days earlier, said his raft had wrapped on rock and torn beyond repair. He'd climbed to wait it out, then waited too long. His voice shook when he talked about nights, about cold that settled into bone, about watching helicopters pass without slowing. They compared supplies quickly, efficiently, neither wanting to admit how little either had left. Together they decided to move before dark. Ethan's raft could carry one safely, two barely, but staying separate now felt worse. The launch was tense, weight uneven, the damaged seam hissing softly, every ripple ahead exaggerated into threat. They drifted more than paddled, conserving, communicating with short looks and nods. The river forced their hand near dusk, a narrow channel squeezing water hard against rock. Mark argued to beach and walk. Ethan argued to push through. Daylight slipping away settled it for them. The raft scraped, twisted, held, then cleared, both men breathing out at once. They grounded again minutes later, too tired to argue further, choosing a spot that offered just enough shelter to matter. That night they took turns staying awake, listening, sharing fragments of stories to keep the dark from filling the gaps. Somewhere upstream a flare popped briefly, orange against stone. Both men sat up at once, counting seconds, waiting for another. It didn't come. When morning arrived, pale and cold, they were already moving, because now they knew waiting could be the most dangerous choice of all. They moved early, before the sun could warm anything, because warmth made you hopeful and hope made you careless. The raft slid back into the river with a sound that felt louder than it should have been, the damaged seam whispering again, a reminder ticking beneath everything they did. Mark sat forward, knees drawn in, eyes scanning ahead like he was afraid the canyon might rearrange itself while he blinked. Ethan kept them close to shore, reading the water by texture more than sight. Darker seams, faint ripples, places where the current hurried as if late. By mid-morning the wind turned against them. Not strong, just constant, pushing upstream, stealing progress inch by inch. They grounded often, dragged the raft, rested, repeated, the routine grinding them down in small, efficient ways. At one stop, Mark froze, hand raised, pointing to the sand ahead. Fresh footprints again, clearer this time, 2 sets, close together, then splitting, one climbing, one returning to the water. Neither man spoke. Both understood the implication. Decisions had been made here, and not everyone agreed. The canyon narrowed after noon, walls closing in, sound compressing, every scrape of rubber against rock echoing too long. The river accelerated, forcing them to choose a line quickly. Ethan angled left. The raft clipped a submerged stone, spun halfway, water sloshing in. They corrected just in time, breath held until the current eased. When they pulled ashore again, the seam had worsened, the leak no longer patient. They patched it with what they had, knowing it was temporary, a promise that would break later. Late afternoon brought the helicopter back, closer than before, unmistakable. Both men ran to open ground, arms high, shouting. The aircraft slowed, banked, then drifted away again, pulled by terrain or fuel or something they couldn't see. Mark dropped to his knees, anger flashing, then draining. Ethan stood longer, forcing himself to watch until it was truly gone, because pretending it hadn't been close felt worse. They camped higher that night, trading exposure for warmth, the conversation thinning as fatigue took over. Near midnight, the river changed its voice, louder, faster, rain upstream they couldn't see, couldn't prepare for. By dawn, the water had risen, erased their tracks, stolen the lowest beach completely. They launched again without debate, because now the canyon was making decisions for them, and it wasn't interested in their preferences. The river was higher now, darker at the edges, faster through the bends, carrying pieces of branches and foam that hadn't been there the day before, evidence of weather upstream that had already made its decision. Ethan kept the raft tight to the inside curves, avoiding the main push, but the extra weight made every correction slower, the patch at the seam flexing, complaining. Mark watched the water instead of the walls now, counting seconds between visible hazards, calling out when he saw trouble early enough to matter. They rounded a bend and found the channel choked, not blocked, but narrowed by fallen rock. The current accelerating through a gap that looked manageable until you noticed how it leaned, how it angled straight toward a slab that waited like a door frame. Ethan grounded the raft hard, jumped out, boots filling instantly, cold biting deep. They stood there in silence, measuring distance, force, fatigue, both understanding that portaging would cost time they might not have, and running it would cost control they couldn't afford. They chose movement. Not courage, not optimism, movement. They unloaded what little they could, lightened the raft, pushed off again, committing before doubt could rebuild itself. The water took them immediately, faster than expected, the raft yawing, correcting late, scraping once, twice, then slamming sideways. The seam tore open with a sound like fabric giving up. Water rushed in, decisive. They didn't shout. They worked. Ethan angled the bow. Mark bailed with his hands, seconds stretching thin. Then the current spat them out into slower water, the raft half full, barely floating. They dragged it ashore, both breathing hard, hands numb, legs shaking. The raft was finished. Not dramatic, not explosive, just done. They sat beside it for a long moment, listening to the river move on without them, then began dividing what could still be carried. The canyon felt closer on foot, heavier, every step uphill a negotiation. They climbed toward higher ground, choosing warmth over proximity, knowing the river would keep rising without asking. Midday passed quietly, too quietly, the kind of quiet that sharpened nerves instead of easing them. Near a ridge break, they found another marker, not fabric this time, but scratched stone, an arrow pointing inland, crude but recent. Mark stopped, stared at it longer than necessary, then nodded once. Someone had gone this way and believed it mattered. The climb beyond was punishing, switchbacks that weren't switchbacks, hands needed as often as feet, breath rationed carefully. When they crested the rise, the view opened just enough to hurt, miles of layered rock, light shifting, beauty that felt almost insulting. Ethan dropped his pack, scanned the horizon, then froze, pointing. Far off, barely visible, a thin column of smoke lifted and bent with the wind. Deliberate, sustained. Not the canyon breathing, but someone trying to be found. The smoke was thin and steady, rising from a shallow fold in the rock far beyond the ridge, not drifting wildly, not fading, controlled enough to suggest intent. Ethan checked the wind, then checked it again, committing the direction to memory. Smoke like that only mattered if it stayed consistent. Mark exhaled slowly, a sound halfway between relief and warning, because smoke meant people, and people meant variables neither of them could predict. The descent toward it was harder than the climb, knees protesting, footing unreliable, every slip threatening to turn momentum into damage. They moved carefully, conserving strength, stopping often to reassess distance, the column of smoke growing and shrinking as terrain interfered with sight lines. By late afternoon, it disappeared entirely, swallowed by rock, forcing a choice they'd hoped to avoid: keep moving on faith or stop and risk losing the trail of it altogether. They chose movement again. Not fast, not desperate, but steady. Near dusk, they found signs that sharpened their focus: boot scuffs on stone, recent, a crushed plant that hadn't had time to wilt, proof that whoever made the smoke had been here and hadn't vanished into the canyon's long memory yet. That knowledge changed the silence, made it heavier, expectant. They rounded a bend and nearly walked into him. A man stood below them on a narrow shelf, hands raised instinctively, as startled as they were, clothes patched mismatched, face burned dark by sun and wind. No one spoke at first, because speaking would break something fragile. Then the man nodded once and said he hadn't expected company, said he'd been burning damp brush to make smoke, said his partner was injured but stable, said they'd been missed on a commercial trip that never came looking. They followed him carefully, packs lighter now with purpose, into a shallow overhang where another man lay wrapped in layers, ankles swollen, eyes alert. Supplies were scarce but organized, water rationed precisely, food measured in days, not meals. They compared timelines, realized how close they'd all come to missing each other by hours, by choices that almost overlapped but hadn't. Night settled in around 4 men instead of 2. The fire kept small, smoke suppressed now that it had done its job. Above them, far away, a helicopter passed, its sound distant but undeniable, all of them listening in silence, counting seconds, waiting for a change in pitch that didn't come. When it faded, no one cursed. They just stared at the dark longer than necessary, because now they knew how close visibility really was, and how narrow the margin remained. They moved before dawn, because waiting had stopped feeling neutral and started feeling dangerous. The injured man, Lucas, was stabilized enough to travel slowly, his ankle wrapped tight, weight shared between a makeshift crutch and Mark's shoulder. The canyon woke reluctantly, cold, clinging to everything, sound carrying too far, every scrape of boot against stone feeling like an announcement. Ethan took the lead, choosing routes that traded distance for safety, avoiding drops that would punish a single mistake. By mid-morning, the wind shifted again, funneling down canyon, flattening sound, erasing any chance of calling for help. The group adjusted without discussion, tighter spacing, shorter rests. Water measured more strictly now that mouths had doubled. When they stopped to reassess, Ethan noticed something that didn't fit. A boot print crossing their path at an odd angle, newer than theirs, heading down toward the river fast. No one admitted it out loud, but they all felt it. Someone else was still moving, and moving with urgency. The terrain tightened after noon, forcing them onto a traverse that demanded focus, hands on stone, eyes down. Halfway across, Lucas slipped, not far, but enough to snap the silence. Mark caught him hard, both men crashing into the wall, breath knocked loose. For a moment, no one moved. Then Lucas laughed once, thin and shaky, and the sound steadied them more than words could have. They reached a narrow bench as clouds rolled in, high and fast, shading the canyon, flattening contrast. The temperature dropped again. That's when they heard it. Rotors, close enough to feel, not see. They spread out instinctively, waving, shouting, tearing fabric loose to make motion bigger than bodies. The helicopter passed once, then banked, slowed, came back lower, close enough that grit lifted from the ground. The crew dropped a line, shouted instructions swallowed by wind. One by one they clipped in, Lucas first, then the others. Timing critical, fear compressed into action. When Ethan felt the lift take him, the canyon falling away beneath his boots, he didn't look down. He closed his eyes and waited for the pull to feel real. Above the rim, the air was warmer, louder, full of hands and voices. As they were guided away, Ethan looked back once, the canyon already reclaiming the bench they'd stood on, erasing their tracks. He understood then how close they'd come to becoming just another correction written briefly in sand, then washed away. The ride out was short but disorienting, the helicopter banking hard over ridgelines, the canyon breaking apart beneath them into angles and shadow, scale returning all at once. Inside the cabin, no one spoke at first, hands gripping straps, eyes fixed on nothing, adrenaline refusing to drain cleanly. A medic checked Lucas's ankle, nodded once, efficient, already moving on, survival turning administrative with alarming speed. When they touched down near the ranger station, the ground felt unstable, as if it might start moving again without warning. Ethan stepped off last, legs weak, head light, the sound of rotors fading, leaving a sudden, ringing quiet. Rangers asked questions in calm voices, timelines, names, launch points, each answer anchoring the experience to something official, something recordable. Mark sat on a bench, elbows on knees, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. They were given water, blankets, instructions they half heard. A ranger mentioned how close the search window had been to closing, how weather upstream had complicated everything, how easily the smoke could have been missed if the wind had shifted again. No one responded. Gratitude felt premature, like celebrating before you'd fully exited the building. Later, as paperwork stretched on, Ethan was handed a small clear bag, items recovered with him, the jagged piece of plastic among them. He turned it over in his fingers, realizing it had been the first thing that slowed him down enough to think instead of react. He set it on the table, didn't ask to keep it. Outside, evening settled over the rim, warm, almost gentle. The canyon lay quiet in the distance, unreadable from up here. No sign of the decisions it had demanded or the corrections it had forced. Ethan understood then that survival wasn't a single moment or a dramatic escape. It was a series of small refusals to hurry, to assume, to follow the first plan just because it was already moving. When they finally separated, promises made without urgency. Mark shook his hand once, firm, then let go. Ethan walked to the edge of the parking lot and stopped, listening, half expecting to hear the river again, the way it never stopped working. He didn't. And for the first time since the raft had rolled, the silence felt earned. The formal ending came days later, quietly, without ceremony. Ethan stood at home unpacking gear that still smelled faintly of river and stone, laying it out piece by piece, noticing what was missing more than what remained. The damaged raft had already been written off, tagged and stored somewhere official, a line item in a report. What stayed with him were smaller things: the sound of water changing pitch before danger, the way smoke behaved in wind, the weight of choosing not to move when every instinct screamed to go. Sleep came unevenly. Some nights he woke certain he'd heard rotors again. Other nights convinced he'd missed a signal, a voice, a chance. The canyon lingered not as fear, but as unfinished business, a place that had tested him without malice and let him leave without apology. He followed the news out of habit, scanning weather reports, river conditions, looking for patterns that now felt personal. Weeks later, a letter arrived, brief, factual, confirming the rescue details, closing the file. At the bottom, handwritten, a ranger had added a single line: "Your signal placement made the difference." Ethan read it twice, then folded the paper carefully, not proud, not relieved, just aware of how thin the margin had been. He thought of the footprints that had confused everyone at first, the corrections written into sand, the decisions made quietly when no one was watching. Survival, he realized, wasn't about strength or luck. It was about noticing when the plan stopped matching reality and having the discipline to change it before the canyon forced the issue. On his last evening before returning to work, he stepped outside as the light faded, listening to ordinary sounds: cars, wind through trees, life moving without effort. Somewhere far away, the river kept working, reshaping stone, erasing evidence, patient as ever. Ethan stood still until the dark settled fully, then went inside, carrying with him the understanding that the most dangerous moment hadn't been the raft rolling, or the cold, or the night, but the instant just before, when everything still seemed under control. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.